Hello and welcome to our panel about gender in the pandemic. We have three scholars with us today and I want to introduce them to you in alphabetical order. So the first is Professor Valerie Francisco Manchavez. She is an assistant professor of sociology here at SFSU, where she works on global and transnational sociology with a special interest on the Philippine migration and diaspora, gender and the family, racial and ethnic relations in the US. She has published widely, including journals like Critical Sociology, Working USA, the Philippine Sociological Review, and International Review of Qualitative Research. Her current book project explores the dynamics of gender and technology in care work in Filipino transnational families in the Philippines and the US. And she is also currently collaborating with Robin Rodriguez on a PAR project about Filipino caregivers and domestic workers to research an understudied industry of caregiving to the elderly. Professor Karen Hossfeld, Associate Professor of Sociology and also the Chair of the Sociology Department, teaches and researches social inequality, class, ethnicity, and gender, families and society, and social aspects of sociology. Dr. Hossfeld is engaged in a long-term study of the lives and labors of immigrant women workers in Silicon Valley factories. And she also works here and in Silicon Valley with environmental and labor organizations. Our third guest today is Professor Julietta. She has a PhD in ethnic studies and she is the author of Trafficking Women's Rights, which was with the University of Minnesota Press in 2011. This book examines US anti-trafficking laws and policies. She has also published research on chimpanzee sanctuaries and the limits of rights framework. Dr. Hua, in conjunction with Dr. Kasturi Ray, also in the Women's Studies Department here at SFSU, is currently researching political organizing around intimate labors, and their current book project will be forthcoming soon. So thank you all for joining us here today. So let me just start out with like a 2-minute introduction to Constitution Day and kind of how the idea for this panel came, and then I can start with a couple of the questions that I circulated, and I'm really happy to have the conversation meander wherever people would like it to go. But the theme for Constitution Day this year is the centennial of suffrage, of women's suffrage. And I kind of tweaked it a little bit, broadened it to have it be the unfinished work of suffrage. And so, you know, women's historians talk a lot about missed opportunities for coalitions. And when we talk about the women's suffrage movement, I think there's been, on the anniversary, a lot of helpful conversations about rifts between primarily white suffrage activists and Black suffrage activists, but also to a lesser extent working women, immigrant women, how these anarchists and other radical women, of course Emma Goldman famously calls suffrage a fetish of activists and is sort of opposed to the campaign. And so that's kind of what's been on my mind, and we have a lot of panels about the 19th Amendment and then the beginning of the fight for the ERA and what voices were excluded and how we can really think about building a more inclusive movement going forward. And so amidst the pandemic, there's just been a lot of talk about women's labor and how a lot of the sort of burden of elder care, of child care, has fallen disproportionately on the shoulders of women. And I just see so many resonances. We're not talking about poor women, we're not talking about immigrant women, we're not always talking about Black women, we're not centering their experiences. A lot of the conversation is on middle class, upper class, white, career, professional women, however we want to think about it. So I reached out to the three of you because I know that your work kind of thinks about contemporary issues more carefully and thoughtfully than me, who is sometimes too stuck in the past. So I guess I'll just start out by saying, is this something that you've noticed too, that this conversation is really kind of prioritizing a particular perspective at the expense of what other women, what other communities are experiencing during these unprecedented times?
And I think we all know that child care and elder care is not newly falling disproportionately on working class women of color. It's an old story. It's really a question of first of all, who's noticing what, and what's getting more exacerbated because of the pandemic. Because I think what's new is that for I don't want to pick on the one poor journalist in the New York Times article, or people who are writing the stories right now, they tend to be professional people, typically professional women, who are newly experiencing having to do a double or a triple shift that other women have been doing for a long time. So it's not that those of us who are professional white women and professional women of color too don't get that, but it's a new experience for some of us. So all of a sudden, the women of color who typically do the care work for us are no longer available to us. And for those working class women, disproportionately women of color, although not all women of color, disproportionately immigrants, the big shift for them is the care work that they used to get paid for, they're not getting paid for. And they don't have something to fall back on the way some of the professional people do. So it's a gender bias against the professional women, but that's only the tip of the iceberg of the story that's getting the attention.
Right. Julie and Valerie, would you agree with that? I see head nodding.
I mean, I would agree. I think my first instinct was to say that it's always been disproportionately, right, carried by women workers. But I think also there are still a lot of immigrant women, mostly, who still work in other people's homes despite the pandemic. So there's an organization in Oakland called Hand in Hand, which is a domestic employer organization, and they've been trying to draw attention to the ways in which actually, despite the pandemic, there have been many domestic workers who still go to work, and they often don't sort of have the privilege or the leverage to sort of negotiate what their work conditions are like. And I think it's important to remember that, and to remember that that actually is the case for a lot of workers in a lot of different sectors. So like the Amazon warehouse workers who were striking, right? Because of their work, basically still having to work in these warehouses in close proximity, or like the meat and food industry, food production industry workers, or the farm workers. So I think it is, I think that there is the kind of disproportionate burden of certain kinds of reproductive tasks on women, but also I think the kind of work of reproduction, like reproductive labor, in the sense of like facilitating lives for other people, is always gendered in ways that both, men workers and women workers sort of experience across the board in different sectors.
Yeah, and I think just to contribute to what Julie's talking about, I think what's most apparent under the pandemic is just the devaluation, the clear devaluation of reproductive labor and care. And I'm going to pull that up a little bit apart. I'm talking like reproductive labor, those who are, doing the work of, sort of in a Marxist feminist way, to think about like tasks and, the actual labor act of caring for elders and children and families, right? But there's also this way in which what's very clear is that care, that is sometimes, not all reproductive labor is done with care, right? In terms of like, I just imagine like my kid growing up as a teen and cleaning her room, like, and slamming her door. I mean, she's doing the reproductive labor that she sure doesn't like. She's not doing it with care. I mean, she does that right now actually as a 5-year-old, but whatever, right? So I think the clear devaluation of the workers who do the reproductive labor that is essential to get folks, working daily, but it also just the value of care in our society right now is, it's very clear that people don't sometimes equate those things together, and they're definitely not valued enough. I think the big sort of slogans of like, thanking frontline workers, I think has been one really great outpouring of revisibilizing the work really of this pandemic, is not just legislating the lockdowns or whatever, but really it's the work of, attending to people's bodies, to people's health. And then even then it is segmented. who we see as frontline workers are, many of them are in the hospital, settings, and we don't see, the Uber drivers and the Instacart drivers who are delivering the groceries, or the caregivers who didn't have an option to shelter in place, right? Live-in caregivers to the elderly, or those who are clocking in to provide elder care in assisted living facilities or in private homes. Like, they never had a chance to shelter in place, right? And they're not necessarily being counted as frontline workers in the social imagination. And so devaluing of those workers is also, you see that happening right now.
And I wonder if the three of you could also talk a little bit about the fact that they're absolutely being devalued, and part of that devaluation is because they're not being seen as workers, right? So there was this conversation about PPE, right, and making sure that we had protective gear for doctors, for nurses, to maybe a little bit to a lesser extent for grocery workers. And I didn't see as part of that conversation for nannies, for live-in elder care, right, for cleaners, there was a little bit of a protest about Uber and Lyft drivers and who was going to pay for those masks, right? And how do we keep the Instacart worker safe, and whose responsibility is that too, right? So maybe in a case like Uber or Lyft, of course it's the corporation that should be providing this PPE. But when people think about someone coming to help with elder care, someone to come, to clean, to help with childcare, it's your responsibility to provide that gear to keep those workers safe. And it just seemed to not be part of this conversation about protecting essential frontline workers. And maybe that's part of because our society isn't used to thinking about them as workers or as essential workers, or we don't think of ourselves as employers when we employ folks who work in the house. I don't know if you have any thoughts about why that was such an invisible, absent part of this conversation.
I think, Sarah, you've hit the proverbial nails on the head. We don't see work we tend not to see work that's done in non-traditional settings, or not non-traditional, non-formalized work settings. We tend not to see that as real labor. And I think particularly for women, it's not that the blame is all on women who employ caregivers, but because of the way women are socialized to think about ourselves, that a lot of women who employ caregivers will say, oh, I don't think of myself as an employer. They're my friend. They're an extension of my family. Well, that could be deconstructed in a lot of ways. But there's a lot of different reasons why we tend to view caregivers as not regular workers, and that's a disservice to people.
Yeah, Julietta, when you were talking about the organization in Oakland that was advocating for people who work in domestic settings, is this part of the conversation, trying to get PPE for these folks and make sure that the situations that they're going into are safe for them, in ways that maybe people aren't making sure that their house or the places that they're working, the cars that they're getting into are going to be safe for their workers?
Yeah, hand in hand, it's interesting. I like them. They're a great organization. But one of the things they work on, they're employers and allies, so not domestic workers. So they are sort of coalitional and support domestic worker rights. And the whole principle of their organizing is to sort of basically do what feminists scholars and activists have been arguing all along, which is to kind of demystify this notion that there's a private and a public distinction, so that for some people, the quote-unquote private space is actually also a public workspace.
Yeah, I think about hand in hand and organizing work employers, because of the casual way in which when we invite people into our home, we want to ensure that we have some sort of affinity, a relationship with them. They're taking care of our family members and things like that. But I think a big part of why the conversation around PPE is not set up to include as Karen said, non-formalized settings of labor, right, is a lot because many reproductive labor work and occupations, what they have in common is that they're precarious. and the precarious nature in which domestic workers have little to no rights, that caregivers, even then, I mean, the caregiving industry in California and all over the United States, one of the most unregulated care industries, right? Meaning there's not lots of people checking up on our labor standards being followed, right? These make all these workers precarious. And when I say precarious, I mean that these workers are easily disposable, right? I don't like that nanny anymore. I'm gonna just get rid of her and get on care.com, right? I don't feel like my elderly family member needs any more care. I'll just get rid of the caregiver, right? Most of these reproductive labor occupations don't have contracts or explicit contracts, right? And so a big part of not considering them workers isn't because of the pandemic. It was already a crisis of reproductive labor, right? It was an ongoing crisis of devaluation and also precarity on the part of reproductive labor. And then we have a sort of dual crisis of the pandemic, wherein the very workers that we rely on are now front and center as the people who we really, really need. And therefore, like, a bunch of the, job insecurities that they had in the past is, basically, exaggerated or exacerbated under the pandemic. And so when I think about Hand in Hand, I really think about their work as part of the coalition for the California Coalition for Domestic Workers' Rights, right? They just won SB 1257, which is the Health and Safety for All Workers Act. It was a bill that basically was in response to the fires. Remember the fires last year? And then, like, we see, like, in LA County, there are, like, nannies being sent in, make sure you dust our mantles, don't mind the wildfire in the background, right? Because most domestic workers are not considered part of the Cal OSHA regulation. And this bill forwards that, or advances that fight, right? And Hand in Hand, and other organizations on the ground, Mujeres Unidas y Activas, the Filipino Community Center, the Chinatown Progressive Association, folks who are in line with the coalition have been doing the work of saying, making sure that, hey, we understand that these types of work is precarious, and it's not just the workers that we need to, like, organize and educate, it's also the employers who are saying, yeah, they are an extension of our family, and they need to be treated well, and they need to be paid fairly. So a big part of the conversation here of, like, this unfinished work of suffrage is really trying to draw a through line between what work is considered devalued and precarious, and at this moment, what does that through line mean for building power for the people in those occupations?
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about that a lot, Valerie, after I read your piece in the SF Chronicle, and because, there's been a lot of sort of thank you doctors, thank you nurses, thank you all other essential workers, without sort of delineating who those people are, all of the essential labor that they provide. I remember my mom was a nurse growing up, and she was like, 99% of the work of a hospital is not done by the nurses or the doctors, right? 99% of the work of the hospital and so much of the work that saves people's lives is going on from all the support staff in the hospital too. And so I wonder too about when we think about sort of the invisibility of work in domestic settings, but also the invisibility of work done by women of color, done by immigrant women in institutional spaces that allow those institutions to run and function. And how the pandemic has, perhaps, I hope, shined a light on how essential workers are. I mean, my mother-in-law was a janitor in New York City for years, and her union is now in the spotlight because those are the ones that are going to be cleaning the schools to open them. I mean, that's the essential work that's going on to open these schools, and yet that labor has been invisible for such a long time. So, you know, I guess my question is again, even in these professional, sort of institutionalized settings, why do we think this work is invisible? How can we make it more visible? How can we center this work in our conversations and coalitions moving forward?
So I have maybe 2 points on that. I think that, you know, what Karen said is sort of the easy answer, right? Like, or it's not, I don't want to make it sound like that. It's what Karen said is right. Like the labor is invisibilized because it's fundamentally devalued. And that devaluing isn't just about the tasks, it's also tied to like bodies, right? So like childbirthing or child rearing has historically been, we've been able to historically as a society devalue it because we create this kind of justification that, well, there are bodies that just birth, right? Wombs birth, that is a course of nature, and therefore it does not need to be compensated or thought of or seen as a kind of sort of a form of activity that's quote unquote productive. And then, you know, when it is like with surrogacy, then it gets sort of complicated. And so in that sense, I think that's like why these questions around the fundamental ways as a society we've historically devalued reproductive labor is also, that's like an issue that's also always been like a racialized one. And I also think, you know, the point around thanking frontline workers I think is really interesting because, and this is, sorry, I'm like not being very articulate, but this will lead to like a policy, you know, outcome maybe, or a policy suggestion I have. I think it's like, I really appreciate that people want to thank essential frontline workers, but sometimes even those very visible frontline workers like nurses actually get fired when they protest their work conditions. And so the point then you know, so then I just hope that when we're thanking frontline workers, we also notice when the very institutional settings that hire them actually don't value them at all, right? Because if you really valued your nurse and your nurse is saying, listen, we don't have the proper supplies or, you know, conditions to do our work safely, and then you, as the employer, you fire them, right? That is like on a systemic level, I think, a problem. And so I think if you really want to thank frontline workers, you have to be willing to advocate on a kind of structural level for like basic living wages, like basic income, things that actually help support like everybody, including those who work in historically undervalued professions.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that about the conversation about K through 12 and opening up K through 12 now. And of course, everybody, there are many parents who are pushing to open up K through 12, and these teachers are saying we don't feel safe going back to school, you know, and if you value our labor, you have to trust our voice on this, you know, and are kind of bravely speaking out on this issue too.
Yeah. What was the policy thing, Julie? What was the policy suggestion?
Oh, I think that this is one of Sarah's questions, the last one, like about creating policy to address the most vulnerable workers. I think that some of those policies need to be about like supporting a minimum wage that is a living wage, right? So I don't even know what it is anymore, $7 and something. It's less than $8 still nationally, right?
$7.35, I think. I just looked it up the other day.
Right. Yeah, right. And so that, I mean, that's not gonna, you know, you can't work full time on that wage, and in probably most, if not all parts of this country, actually sustain a living, let alone like sustain a living for more than just yourself. And so, yeah, so I think if you want to really thank like essential workers, I think you need to think about like these kind of bigger issues around, you know, how do we even value and institutionalize like how we compensate workers.
I also think that, you know, what Julie's talking about in terms of this devaluing of care as attached to bodies, we have inherited a racialized and gendered idea of who does this care and how we value it, right? And I want to make sure that anytime I'm talking about, Filipino migrant workers who are in the care industry, that I'm always connecting it to enslaved Africans as, the first set of devalued workers that this country basically built itself on, right? And so I think this is not a policy suggestion, but I do think that what does it need to do, what does it need to continue on this work of like revisibilizing this, is we do have to think about the systemic ways that it's racialized. And so like valuing care work and the care workers has to be anti-racist, and it has to be feminist, right? And I think, and what I mean by that is that it has to be valuing the bodies, and then also has to be tracing the historical ways in which that we got here in the first place, right? And that takes not just it's like I feel like I'm trying to say something around a cultural shift, right? And I mean, the most blunt way I could say this, and haters come holler at me, okay? Let's keep this pandemic going, right? Like, let's keep this shelter in place and lockdown going. I'm struggling, y'all. You know what I mean? I'm struggling. And I think if we see that families are struggling with not having schooling or childcare or elder care, then perhaps we can shift. There can be a paradigm shift when we can reintegrate back into our society in a different way. Like, we have a different approach or relationship to care now that we've been sheltered in place, or reopening and then locking down again, and reopening and locking down, all of that, like, that jolts us into a different kind of relationship to care and care workers. And so I feel like if folks don't get it yet, you know what I mean, like, that all of us are going to get older, we're all going to need care. And if we have families, there are going to be young people that need care and teaching. Like, this is going to be a constant, and so I think under the pandemic conditions, what we need to do to keep this work kind of in line, like in vision, is we have to stay in this, we really have to be present and not keep looking at, oh, what's the plan for December or whatever. It's like, yeah, every parent is disappointed and horrified at either sending their child to school or, keeping them home. And so that then reorganizes sort of our relationship to care.
Well, Valerie invoked a historical framework, and that got me really excited as a historian. But I think it's important, and one of the questions, this sort of through line to suffrage, is what is the role and responsibility of white women here? And as historians, one of the things that we talk about is white women as one of the sort of keys to white supremacy, because white women have often seen their allies as white men in a racist system instead of immigrant women, Black women, right, working class women, and developing a feminism that embraces a much larger framework. And one of the things I read, Tressie McMillan Cotton had a piece maybe about a week ago, and she was saying that this pandemic is forcing people, women in particular, to feel their class in ways that they haven't before. Because what she was saying is that there are so many white women in particular rely on the labor of immigrant women, working women, oftentimes undocumented women, to access a class, a sort of lifestyle that they want to lead, that they would be unable to do without that labor. So, and not just, certainly childcare, certainly, help house care, but also going out to eat, also nail and hair salons, also, I'm thinking about Julietta's work, hopping a Lyft when you're running, behind schedule, or having it scheduled to pick your kids up from school, right? And have those Uber services for to bring kids to all their different lessons. So that what the, I mean, I'm thinking about what Valerie was saying, what the pandemic has also just crystallized is that one of the policies I think moving forward is for white women to keep in mind the way that their class position is intertwined with their race position, and to maybe, I'm not going to be as articulate here as I wanted to and be able to tie it all together, but to just really, I think, can somebody help me out here? You know what I'm saying? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
As a Karen, speak up. I've really been examining the role of white women in all this, and I think that's an ongoing conversation, maybe more for another day. But I did want to make the connection of what it means in this historic moment for the pandemic lessons we're learning to be happening simultaneously with the surgence in interest in Black Lives Matter. I think that those two movements are informing themselves in really interesting ways that, although I'm devastated by the need for for both the movements around both those issues, I'm very inspired by the potential for organizing, because I think it's bringing class and race and gender, maybe a little bit less so gender right now, issues together to people, and more people acknowledging. And I just read a new survey that the majority of people between the ages of 18 and 35 say racism is the biggest issue affecting in this country. And whites say that as well. Males and females both say that. So this is not a direct answer to your question, Sarah, but I think we are looking at the potential for new forms of solidarity. Maybe history should teach us not to be too hopeful, but this is a moment, and I'd rather see it as an exciting potential.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very hopeful. I want, the last question that I had posed to everybody that I want to make sure we cover before we leave is, we're talking a lot about people and the jobs that they have and protecting them at the jobs that they have. But it is also true that a lot of women, particularly women of color, particularly immigrant women, have lost jobs. And that I saw somebody was referring to it as the she-cession, right? So the he-cession was all the jobs in construction and manufacturing that were lost during the last downturn, but that the job loss now is falling disproportionately on the shoulders of women. And so I didn't know if people had thoughts about the fact that you know, a lot of the service industry jobs that have been lost, hopefully temporarily, but probably as a restructuring happens moving forward, maybe not as temporarily, that, you know, so many people, either if women are the ones who are earning the money for the household in single parent households or in dual parent households, you know, and they've lost this income, how are the job losses being suffered by industries that are predominantly women? You know, what kinds of policies should we think about moving forward for the she-cession?
It's an old cliche historic line, but I still like it, you know, raises not roses. Mm-hmm. Essential workers, and including the umbrella of who's an essential worker, and our thanks is important, but thanks alone don't get us very far. So it has to be wage increases and continuing unemployment benefits, and also looking at things like, since women, and particularly women of color and immigrants, earn less over their lifetimes, what does even a year or two of wage loss mean in terms of being able to get out from under your debt, invest in your future? So we have to look at things like home loans and other types of things that can help over the long haul right some of the inequities. So I don't want to look at it just as the pandemic, but the pandemic putting a lens on the lost work for a group of people who are already underpaid and undervalued. What it means for, let's say, if somebody of my kind of income level as a professor were to lose a year of wages, that's a much different and lesser consequence than somebody who is working as a domestic worker or as an Uber driver losing a year. There's lifetime consequences the economic forecasts are showing for them. So I want to look at policies that will let people rebuild, not just get their job back, but rebuild what they've lost over that year or two.
I think for women also, and for women of color and immigrant and undocumented women who are doing the work of care, I think you know, they're pulling double, triple shifts now. And I think there are ways in which, you know, this idea of all professionalized or formalized work should also take into account how much are on women's shoulders, because it's sort of ascribed work, right? For mothers who are in a professional position, and even, you know, women who are not in professional positions. I think there has to be some ways that policies address and acknowledge that women are, you know, taking a big part of their domestic work alongside of, you know, the work that they have. I see these like memes going around like, you know, 2020 is the year of the mom, because the moms are doing it all, and they're, you know, meeting their benchmarks at work, and they're homeschooling, and they're cooking and cleaning, and it's like, that's maddening, you know, like it's, I mean, it is actually not the year of the mom, it's the year of moms being exhausted. And I think work, you know, institutions or employers need to sort of acknowledge and make space for that, and understand that, you know, there is a balancing happening at the moment. I want to say last thing about that is obviously we're coming at that in very different ways. A domestic worker can't go to their employer and say, hey, you know that I'm also taking care of my own children, or you know what I mean? Like there are power asymmetries in which, you know, professional women can be like, hey, I'm working from home, but can I get a 4-day weekend? And, you know, whatever. Those negotiations are moot for immigrant women, women of color, and undocumented women. And I just want to put that out there as that it's a part of how workers, you know, assert themselves with their workplaces, but it's also a systemic, it's also a systemic downfall that not all women are going to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Karen and Valerie, when you're talking about policy positions, one of the things that popped into my mind, in case hopefully students will be watching this for Constitution Day, is student debt. And I think people of color take on disproportionately more debt in trying to and to make their way through school. And I think that young people in particular have been affected by the economic downturn, with a lot of certainly the gig economy losing some of that additional income. And so one of the things that I've seen circulated to keep in mind moving forward is that we're going to have to do some pretty serious debt relief, debt abolition for people coming out of this pandemic, for all people, but particularly for young people.
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, personally, I think it's kind of a moment to advocate for like universal basic income, because you're right, there's like historic unemployment, but one way you can sort of help people or help ourselves when we're faced with, you know, challenges like these is just to make sure people can access the basic necessities, right? So I'm hoping that maybe, and this kind of goes back to what Valerie was saying, that this is a moment that helps us reevaluate like what we value and how we value it. So if you really care about people who do, or if you really sort of value reproductive labor, then, you know, you might extend Social Security. You might think about like, what do we owe each other as a society? So what should we invest in together in terms of like our collective resources, right? And so we've decided a long time ago that Social Security was something we, like enabling some workers to retire without sort of worry in some ways, was something that we were going to invest in as a society. But it wasn't something, I mean, there are so many limitations already to Social Security, right? So domestic work, agricultural work, all that stuff is not, it's not sort of, doesn't accrue Social Security unless you do cleaning like in an industrial setting, or if you do like attendant work in like a nursing home or something, right? And even then you have to be documented. You can't be undocumented. But if you really care about that kind of labor, then I think you can't draw those lines. You can't say, well, we're going to value it as a society, but only if you're sort of documented, or, you know, only if you filled out what is it, like a W-2. So I'm hopeful that maybe we'll start to sort of think about like what we value together, and then start to maybe think about how to reshape our existing kind of structures to support those things that we decide that we value. Mm-hmm. But I'm afraid that we won't agree. Sorry.
I mean, I'm hopeful too. I do think that in these times we have to have this kind of radical hope in terms of reimagining what's going to be anew after all of this, you know. And I think a part of that, like I said, is being super present at the moment. And, you know, with all the struggles and the challenges that working families are facing, that might inform how people legislate and how people show up for, you know, this year's elections. Because I think that lots of people are struggling, lots of people are having a hard time. Our students are having a really hard time. And I think that it behooves us to really interrogate the ways in which this American life and this country has valued care, and also behooves us to think about, like, you know, Julie was saying, who do we care for, and, you know, what new agreements can we come up with to have a different kind of world where care workers and precarious workers, Uber and Lyft drivers and restaurant workers, hotel workers are not at the bottom of the, you know, pecking order here, because they are as essential, you know, as work is, you know, work is so valuable right now, and they're the ones out there daily. So yeah, I'm hopeful too.
Well, if I can circle all the way back to the beginning, the unfinished work of suffrage, I mean, one of the things that was a real fierce debate at the beginning of the 20th century is, you know, the vote's not enough for women, right? They have to, it was like the vote and now the work gets started. And of course, the famous Alice Paul introduces the ERA on the very date the 19th Amendment is ratified. And so I guess, you know, the sort of through line to the end, and I love where all of you ended, and I really want to thank you for that, is the vote is still not enough, right? I mean, we're talking about, I mean, sort of two things. One, change on an individual interpersonal level. Who is in your life? How do we interact with them? How can we provide support for them? Make sure that, you know, the people that whose labor you're relying on is not invisible to you, right? We have responsibilities to each other. And then also absolutely vote, right? But we can't stop there, that there's structural change that needs to happen that goes far beyond November. And that, you know, movements for unionization and movements for regulating fair work, movements, you know, for making sure that dreamers have a place in this society. You know, Karen brought up Black Lives Matter, and movements that address police violence. That all of these things are incredibly important, and my plug, beyond the unfinished work of suffrage, right? That we can't sort of, Emma Goldman again, fetishize the vote and think that that's our only responsibility to each other and to society, that in fact there's kind of a much larger responsibility that we all have if we value people, if we value these communities, if we value their labor, on making sure that it's visible and it's protected and it's honored and it's valued.
Yeah, I think that one part I want to just contribute to that is I've been organizing with and researching with migrant workers for over a decade now. And, you know, when this whole thing around like Zoom and, you know, keeping in contact with families hella far away or whatever, I'm like, wow, you know, Filipino domestic workers been done that, like, since hella long ago, you know what I mean? And, you know, check my book out if you need a little reference for that. But I think that migrant workers, especially undocumented ones, where unions are not open as an organizing model, have created communities of care, of mutual aid, and political organizing, to be quite honest, to make themselves, their lives, their work, their voices really visible. And so I think that there are already ways that people are getting really creative in terms of organizing on Zoom, virtually, keeping folks safe in terms of, you know, the public health pandemic. But I think there's so much to be learned right now about the cropping up of like cooperative childcare, you know, across families, or, you know, migrant workers, and, you know, Black feminist scholars have taught us that, you know, kin have been a tremendous resource for working women of color, and that's also really been a source of not just care, but also politicization. And so I think when I say I have radical hope, it's because I do see so many migrant women, women of color, sort of coming up with new ways outside of the vote, outside of that vote, to really deepen democracy. Like, the idea of democracy isn't just that you go out and vote in November, right? The most robust way I've seen democracy was in the Philippines, in the streets, where tens and thousands of people, you know, from urban poor to peasants, have come to, you know, shut down administrations. And they didn't use a vote. They used mass organizing and movement building, and, you know, continued consciousness raising, educating, and politicizing people to really change not just a structural, you know, not just the structural laws or whatever, but the cultural shift that I was talking about earlier.
Yes, change often happens outside the ballot box and in the streets.
Yes, and maybe one other unfinished work of suffrage is that suffrage is only meaningful if people can easily access and exercise the right. And that is actually not yet a reality for even people who have, people who are sort of legally entitled to vote in this country. So that's another part of this maybe that we can work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I'm trying to move through on a policy level at the university is, I mean, our students are not given election day off as a recognized holiday, right? And so what a simple, easy policy change to be able to try and encourage them to exercise their right when so many of them have either been disenfranchised by policies that don't recognize their residency here and where they're at university, and or they're blocked by doing so because of their work and study schedules. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate it. It was really fantastic talking to the three of you, and my students will greatly appreciate this too as we mark Constitution Day, and hopefully as we defend a robust Constitution moving into 2020. All right, exactly.
Organize.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's good to see also you both, all of you, but Valerie especially, and Karen, good to meet you, or see you, and Sarah, good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Thank you, everybody.
I said you briefly, but your work is fantastic, and it's a great contribution, so thank you.
The book is coming out soon, so everybody keep an eye out for it. All right,
Excellent.
stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. Bye.
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 Thanks, Sarah.